Good evening, everyone, and welcome to TKE Presents Online. My name is Rob Ekman, and I am the Marketing Director at the King's English Bookshop. Tonight, we are gathered online to celebrate Cold Snap, the fourth book in the Arliss Cutter series, and we're joined tonight by author Marc Cameron, who will be in conversation with author and artist Brian Lee Durfee. The King's English Bookshop has been on the corner of 15th South and 15th East in Salt Lake City for 44 years, matching books to readers. The bookshop is open for browsing 7 days a week, and we gratefully accept your orders at kingsenglish.com. Now tonight we are broadcasting on Crowdcast, and I want to give you all a very short tour of the platform and tell you how you may interact with Marc. First of all we can see of each of you is the name that you registered as and a small icon. We can't see into your living room, and we can't see what books are on your bookshelves. If you have connectivity issues, please click your refresh button on your taskbar. On the right-hand side of your screen, you see a chat box. This is where you can post comments and greetings. Please keep your comments civil, or you may be removed from the chat. We will have an audience question and answer period after Brian and Marc's conversation, so please type your questions for them in the chat box as you have them. We're happy to offer this programming at no charge, but we want to sell you a book. In the center bottom of your screen, you see a green box that says Buy the Book from the King's English, and that link will take you directly to our website, where you can purchase copies of Cold Snap that include an autographed bookplate, as well as Brian's books. And Brian, I believe, is local and will come in and sign them. Finally, this event is being recorded, and you can replay it anytime you like using the same link you joined us with, or in the archives on Crowdcast. It's my great honor to introduce our two guest authors tonight. Brian Lee Durfee is an artist and writer raised in Fairbanks, Alaska, and Monroe, Utah. He has done illustrations for Wizarding of the Coast, Tolkien Enterprises, Dungeons and Dragons, the Humane Society Wildlife Trust Fund, and Denali National Park, and many more. His art has been featured in Spectrum, Best of Contemporary Fantastic Art #3, and Writers of the Future Volume 9. He's the author of the fantasy series 5 Warrior Angels and lives here in Salt Lake City. New York Times bestselling author Marc Cameron's Jericho Quinn thriller series debuted in 2011. Since then, he's written 8 Quinn novels and 4 Arliss Cutter novels featuring a deputy U.S. Marshal based in Alaska. Marc is also the author of 5 Tom Clancy, Jack Ryan Sr. novels for the Tom Clancy estate, including the most recent, Shadow of the Dragon and Chain of Command. A retired chief deputy U.S. Marshal, Marc spent nearly 30 years in law enforcement. He holds a second-degree black belt in jiu-jitsu and is a certified law enforcement scuba diver and man-tracking instructor. Now, the job of a deputy U.S. Marshal is extremely varied. Marc's career focused primarily on dignitary protection, fugitive operations, and as a member of the Rural Tactical Tracking Unit for the U.S. Marshals District of Alaska, Marc routinely tracked lost hikers, hunters, and fugitives in the vast Alaska bush. Originally from Texas, he is an avid outdoorsman, sailor, and motorcyclist, and he and his wife are joining us from Alaska, where they raised their 3 kids. Brian and Marc, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Rob. Appreciate it.
Oh, we're thrilled that you're here. Now, real quick, I see a note already. The top half of your faces are cut off. Catherine, I would check your camera because that is a new one to me.
I'm trying to scoot down.
Yeah, that's right. Just go down to the bottom of the screen. And you might want to refresh your screen using the refresh button as well. Okay, Marc, Brian, it's all you. I'm going to be here in the corner of the screen if you need anything at all. Have a great time.
Thanks, sir. Hey, Brian, thanks for doing this.
Hey, thanks for inviting me. Why don't we just spend a minute and tell each other how we met online? How did you find out about my YouTube channel? Because that is where we met.
Yep. So the editor for my Clancy, the Jack Ryan novels, sent me a text saying, "Hey, I stumbled on this guy. Have you seen it?" And it was you. I can't remember the title of it. It was like Strange Happenings at Barnes and Noble or something like that. And I watched it, and I really, fortunately, you didn't say anything. I don't think you'd read the books yet, so you didn't say anything terrible about them. But I like the way you talked, and I like your persona on screen. So asked you to help me out here. When I found out you were another author, that just was icing on the cake.
Yeah, it was called Strange and Disturbing Things Found at the Barnes and Noble. It's a very clickbait title, but it has got close to 50,000 views. It's one of my top videos.
Yeah.
One of my top videos. But I had read your Tom Clancy books, so I was familiar with your name. I just didn't realize you had written your own series or even the Western series. So when I accidentally stumbled across both of them at the same time, not realizing you were the same guy, I thought that was kind of cool. That's why I made the video.
No, that was fun. That was really fun.
So, since we started with the Tom Clancy, I kind of wanted to ask you, I was curious. I'm a writer myself, so I know how hard it is to break into the business and get traditionally published. Did you write the Tom Clancy books first? Is that your break-in, or did you have previous novels that you broke into the business with?
Well, that's a good question. No, you don't. The thing about the Clancy, the Jack Ryan novels, the Tom Clancy novels, is you really don't politic for them. They come to you, and so you have to, I had to have work out there already. And I was very fortunate that I met Mark Graney, who was doing them before. He does the Gray Man. I think you've actually done some YouTubes on Mark's Gray Man series. And we met years ago at a VoucherCon, kind of like a mystery writers conference in Long Beach, I think is where we met. But I'd written up to that point, I'd written 6 Westerns, 2 of them under another pen name, 4 of them as a ghostwriter with, for another established writer. It's kind of how I broke in by submitting my Western manuscripts, and they said, "Well, let's try you out on this other guy's stuff." So I'd written those, and then I wrote a couple books that I never got published, and then I got some advice from an editor that sent me a rejection letter through my agent. I have a really wonderful agent named Robin Rue, who picked me up on the Westerns. And the advice was write over the top, write something. With my job at that point, I was working with the U.S. Marshals. They said, with your experience in guns and driving fast and all of that, write something Jason Bourne, James Bond, and coincidentally, and this is something that might interest you, this was back in the early 2000s. This particular editor, when they gave me that advice, they ended that email or that rejection letter with, and anyway, now this book was about Alaska Native kids that had seen a crime, and it was set down in Craig, and there's a big chase scene. The whole book was a chase. But he said, anyway, who cares about Alaska, and who cares about a bunch of Alaska Native kids? And this was sort of before, well, not sort of, it was before we had the 20 reality TV shows set up here, and so a lot of people didn't know where we were. But so I went back to the drawing board, kind of upset, wrote this over-the-top. If it was published in the 70s, it would be like Matt Helm, they're fun to write, but they're definitely stretching probability of Jericho Quinn novels. And Mark read those and gave one of those novels to Tom Colgan with Putnam, and he showed it to the Clancy estate, and then they chose me for the Clancys. So it was kind of a long, drawn-out process. I would say, when you talk about breaking in, though, that conferences, and you and I, before we started, were talking about different Comic-Cons and conferences and things like that. that's how I broke in. I didn't send in a query. I sent in dozens of queries and got nowhere, but I had to meet them face to face. I was interested because I haven't talked to you about how you broke in. Did you start with a query letter, or how was that?
Yeah, I wrote my fantasy novel, and I wrote a big, huge, epic horror novel, kind of like Stephen King. I kind of wrote them at the same time, and the horror novel I finished first, and I just went through the regular slush pile. I just submitted to different agents. I didn't know any of them, but I did preface my query letters with the fact that I was a book cover illustrator, that I'd worked for Dungeons and Dragons and Magic the Gathering, and which are some big companies that they would know.
Right.
So I tried to kind of leverage that, my artwork a little bit, which I think helped. I sent about 100 query letters on my horror novel, and got 100 rejection letters. But some of them had personalized notes saying, "Hey, you're really good, you're really talented. I just don't see this novel being marketable, or I don't represent horror." And so then a couple of years later, I finished my big epic fantasy, which is, The Forgetting Moon right here. And instead of sending out 100 query letters, I just sent out 6. I picked the top 6 agents in New York City that represented the top fantasy novelists, and I targeted them, and I got manuscript requests from all 6 of them. So at that point, I had my choice.
Right. And
then I signed with the one that I thought was the best, and a couple of weeks later, he got me a book deal with Simon & Schuster. So,
that's great.
It can work. The slush pile can work out. I mean, I was a nobody, just a prison guard. I was just a prison guard, with a dream to be a writer.
That's cool.
That's how it worked out.
I like hearing those kind of stories. Now, you and I are both from Alaska, right? I mean, I'm from Texas originally, but I've lived here 26 years. So, and you grew up where?
Yeah, I'm from Alaska originally and live in Utah now. So I grew up most of my youth in Fairbanks, Alaska.
So obviously you can tell by the cover that my book is based in Alaska, or at least someplace mountainous and snowy. And it's Alaska is a big character in my books. You're writing fantasy novels, right? When you were world building, does your time in Alaska contribute to that at all?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The landscape of my fantasy land is sort of a mixture between the Alaskan range and the highlands in Scotland. It's kind of a mixture of that. And a lot of the creatures that I have crawling around in my fantasy universe there's doll sheep, there's muskox, there's grizzly bears, there's polar bears. They're not called grizzly bears or polar bears, they're called something. But the Alaskan landscape, anybody who's lived in Alaska, the landscape of Alaska will affect you for the rest of your life. It's a magical place, and you'll always kind of compare everything you see in the world to Alaska, whether it's the Swiss Alps, the highlands in Scotland, the Rocky Mountains that are behind my house here in Utah. They all kind of pale in comparison to Alaska, I feel. So I understand why Alaska is a huge character in your Arliss Cutter series, and I feel it.
Well, I'm glad. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, I noticed. I was gonna ask you. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I just started reading Forgetting Moon, and you have I think it's a river, or no, a kingdom. It's a kingdom called Golconda.
Yes.
Is that from the river up here? Is that inspired by the river?
We used to go whitewater river rafting on the Golconda River.
I've been down it many times.
I still have, my dad shot a lot of videos of us doing that. I still have those videos. I look at them once in a while.
Yeah, that's a great, wild and scenic river. That's cool. Yeah, it jumped out on me. That was kind of cool. I would, if I wouldn't have known you from your YouTube channel now, I would have said, that guy's from Alaska. That's so cool. Yeah.
There's a few other hints. There's a few other things in there that are Alaska. You know, I draw from it a lot.
Speaking of drawing, I noticed in the last review I watched on YouTube that you got a shirt with a doll sheep. Was that for that's one of my favorite animals. I just think they're so amazing and they stand out so starkly. You wonder how they stay alive in the wild because they're always white. They're not, I mean, in the winter, of course, they're hard to see, but was that for a commission? Like, did you do that for?
No, that was a personal piece that ended up being picked up by the Humane Society, and they made a postcard of it in conjunction with, they made posters and postcards and a bunch of things out of it in conjunction with Denali National Park. But it was just a piece that I did. It was I took a photograph of a doll sheep that my dad had taken up in the Brooks Range, and I just sort of put it in a landscape with a waterfall. It was an acrylic painting. The original painting is larger than this painting behind me, but yeah, that's how I got my. When I was in college, I did a lot of paintings. I don't paint anymore. I just
just writing probably takes plenty of time.
Yeah.
So you and I are both. I'm retired from the United States Marshals. You're still in law enforcement and corrections. Do you? I mean, we talked about this a little bit before. My books, particularly the Cutter books, I really draw a lot. Now, I wouldn't say I ever base anything on, any body in particular, but I certainly inspires the characters. How about you when you write? I mean, you're, like I say, you're world building. How does your job play into that?
Like I talked to you before, I kind of want to write a novel set in a prison, kind of like Shawshank Redemption or The Green Mile, but I think that a lot of the stories that come out of the prison, a lot of the stuff that I've seen, I don't know if people would believe it if it was put in a fiction. You know what I mean? It's that crazy,
exactly.
Outlandish.
Exactly what you mean.
I think people would think it was preposterous, and then I'd have to dial it back a little bit, and then I don't also want to have stories that are too specific,
right,
to actual individuals.
Absolutely. It's interesting you say that about dialing it back. That I can see that.
I'm sure that if me and you went to dinner, we could talk for 6 hours at night of all the crazy stuff we've seen.
Oh yeah, my wife. I tend to be kind of an oral storyteller. I tell the story in my head as I'm writing it, watch the movie, kind of a thing. I grew up with relatives from Louisiana and Texas that would sit on the porch and shell purple hull peas and tell stories, and so I grew up hearing that. And law enforcement folks are that way as well. We like to tell war stories, and kind of, in some ways, that's the way you stay alive. You teach the younger people how they're supposed to react by telling stories. No crap, I was there, kind of a thing, and this is the way it went down.
It's also kind of a way to cope. It's kind of a way to cope with the trauma of the story. Is to kind of read.
Absolutely, no doubt. But several times over the course of my career, I will kind of float the story. Like, I'll be working on something, I'll kind of float the story that inspired it at a social or something where my wife and I are sitting, and when she starts like kicking me under the table, I know I've hit the sweet spot. That when everybody's face turns white, and I know okay, that's good. I'm gonna dial it back just a hair, and that's what goes in the book. So when I tell stories from the prison with other prison guards, everything goes. If I tell stories about the prison around the dinner table, I realize my audience is different, and I
sometimes I've gotten carried away, and the shock and horror on people's faces lets me know that maybe I've carried.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I used to. People are always. I used to help with Boy Scouts when my kids were younger. When my sons were in Boy Scouts, and then they just kept me in for a while. But you know what it's like with bears up here, and going camping and stuff. And I always knew that if I just told some really rip-roaring, terrifying stories before bedtime, that I could go to sleep, and they would stay up all night listening to everything and kind of guard for me. So yeah, storytelling is definitely worthwhile. I was early in my career, in my Marshal Service career, I'd been on probably 7 years in law enforcement, but my partner and I'd been on with the Marshals maybe 2 years, and my partner and I got a parole violator warrant. So there's no such thing as, I don't know if there's still parole in the state of Utah, but in the federal system, parole's been abolished. They have supervised release, they don't have parole. So, but during this little overlap period, if we got a parole warrant, they were very cut and dried for us because they didn't have to go to court. The court had already happened in absentia, and then we went and got them and took them back to prison. There was no hearing or anything like that. It was just a parole violator went to prison. And I remember we got this guy, and it was for a white-collar crime, but he was a big dude, and he was going back to Seagoville. And FCI Seagoville, I don't know how your prisons are set up, but in the federal system, USP or U.S. prison is more of the Shawshank kind of place. FCIs, or federal correctional institutions, they still look like a prison. You can't leave. There's 2 fences, there's guard towers and all that, but the people there are not as, generally the crimes are not as rough. So he was going to FCI, Seagoville was an FCI. So we took him back, or we picked him up like 4 o'clock in the morning when you go to get people that, you want them just waking up in the morning. So it's just safer for us. So we got him like 4:30 or 5. And he's a super nice guy. He's probably one of 2 people I've ever arrested that I let him actually hug his family goodbye, because that's a real dangerous thing, to let a person hold their baby when you're going to take them away. So I let him say goodbye, and he got in. And I was a writer back then. I wasn't published, but I wanted to learn about people. I just loved to chat with folks. And we talked, and it was about an hour's drive to Seagoville. And I remember maybe 10 minutes out, I looked in the rearview mirror, and the guy was puffed up, and his hands were cupped behind his back because it was a short haul. And he kind of puffed up, and he was getting this furrowed look on his brow, and he's breathing through his nose. And I thought he was having, like, going into shock or something. And I said, "You all right back there, buddy?" And he said, No, I'm fine. I'm just putting on my prison face. It's the only way I'm really going to get by in there. Because he's just so nice. He's just a super sweet, nice guy. And I never forget that. He had been in before, and he kind of knew that I'm going to have to change my attitude when I go in there.
Prison is a different universe. It is the Utah State Prison where I work. We've got about 6,000 inmates, ranging from maximum security gang units all the way down to the lower security levels. And then we've also got women's units and a drug rehab program and a sex offender program. So everybody is on the same site. We're all right there under the same fence.
Just different units within.
Just different units. So yeah, it depends on what unit you're working. Like right now, I work in the maximum security gang unit, and I teach. I started in the mental health unit. I moved to the gang unit. Then I ran all 6 prison libraries for about 4 years as security staff in the library. And now I took a promotion into the education department where I teach life skills. And so, most especially in that maximum security gang unit where I teach the life skills, it is a different world. It's a violent world, and people do have to put on a certain persona just to survive and get along.
Yeah. I think that's. Are you getting Are you getting feedback from me?
Not me.
Okay, I can stand it. I think that's a good illustration of what it's like to be an author. There's